Alright, so now imagine that you as a nation's government have decided that you do want to intervene in international trade for whichever of the reasons that we outlined in the previous video. There are a number of different ways in which you can do this and a number of different instruments of trade policy at your disposal. And the first that we're going to look at today is the tariff, and this is certainly the oldest form of trade policy and probably the most common. As you can see, even Buzz Lightyear is seeing them everywhere. We can break tariffs down into two specific categories. Or funnily enough, specific tariffs or ad valorem tariffs. Overall, tariffs are effectively a tax that is imposed on products that are imported into a country to make them more expensive relative to the locally produced products, and therefore protect the local producers. Now, in terms of these two specific categories, specific tariffs are levied as a fixed charge for each unit. So imagine that something is an imported item is worth $10. There might be a specific tariff of $1 per item. So obviously every item that's imported into Australia goes from being $10 to having to be sold for $11 after the specific tariff. An ad valorem tariff, which is a Latin term meaning to the value of, effectively, they are levied as a proportion of the value of the imported goods. So rather than being a fixed rate, it's generally a percentage. So it might be a 10% tariff. And in that same scenario where the unit is worth $10, it would then be 10% of $10 is $1, obviously. Add that extra dollar on, it goes from $10 to $11 once it's imported into Australia. So you end up with the same outcome, but there are different ways of adding on that additional tax or tariff. Obviously, the end result here is that we as consumers end up having to pay more for those certain imports which do have a tariff applied to them. So in that scenario, that went from costing us only $10 to $11 after the tariff. This, of course, increases government revenues, and means that from an overall perspective, they're certainly pro-producer because they are protecting the local producers by making the foreign competition more expensive and therefore less competitive. But they're also anti-consumer because it means that while the local producers are being protected, we as consumers are having to pay more overall for products that are not produced within our country. As a consequence, they generally are seen as reducing the overall efficiency of the world economy and are not necessarily the best way to intervene in international trade from a government perspective. And we can see a couple of famous quotes here down the bottom which illustrate that. Milton Friedman, one of the all-time most recognised economists, saying that the benefits of the tariffs are visible. You know, you can see when there is an additional cost on imports, which is protecting the local workers. But the indirect flow-on consequences and implications of tariffs is the thing that hurts us, not just for us as consumers having to pay more, but also the increased supply costs which often result from the application of tariffs. And you can also see Julius Caesar, one of the great Roman leaders who obviously spoke Latin, who was somewhere quoted saying, "I hate ad valorem tariffs." He may or may not have actually said that, but you do get the point here. Subsidies are another very common instrument of trade policy here, and this is where the government pays it gives a payment rather to a domestic producer in order to encourage them to produce goods and services in a particular industry. And this may be in the form of cash grants, it may be low interest loans or generous tax breaks, which effectively make it cheaper for those local producers to actually do their business. So obviously it does help those domestic producers firstly compete against low-cost foreign imports. So if we look at the case of Holden here in Australia, they were given subsidies by the federal government and indeed the more local governments, the state and local governments, to basically prop them up and enable them to compete against these foreign imports which had a lower cost structure, mainly because they were being manufactured in countries which had lower labour costs than what we have here in Australia. It also helped gain those firms and local producers which are being subsidised, helps them gain export markets, and this was also the case for Holden here in Australia. The additional funding that they received from the government was partly enabled them to manufacture and develop a left-hand drive program so that they were able to manufacture vehicles which could then be sold overseas in left-hand drive markets. The problem here is that it can lead to overproduction and inefficiencies in production overall. So obviously, when companies are not being forced to compete on their own, when there isn't that sort of survival of the fittest mentality, and they're being sort of propped up by the government, they can sort of rest on their laurels and say, well, we don't really need to be as competitive as we have to be, because the government will just continue to support us. And this, of course, leads to inefficiencies in the way that that business is run. They're not running at their leanest and most efficient. Of course, this in turn typically means that we as consumers absorb the costs of subsidies, and this is for a number of reasons. Not only because these firms are not being as efficient as they should be, which typically leads to higher costs and therefore higher prices of their products, but also the subsidies that the governments give to the firms have to come from somewhere, and most commonly that is they are derived from taxes that we as taxpayers contribute to the government, which then are passed on in the form of subsidies. So again, very much pro-producer and anti-consumer. Import quotas are the third type we're going to look at here, and this involves the restricting of the quantity of a particular good that may be imported into a country. So the US for a long time had a quota on cheese imports, funnily enough, and also in the textiles industry, where they recognised that, again, the labour costs were higher in the US than a lot of the other countries which were strong in the textile industry, which had very low labour costs. And so they tried to protect their local producers by effectively limiting the amount of textile-based products which were able to be imported into the US to protect those local producers. And that import quota was known as the Multi-Fibre Agreement. As of, what year was it? 2005, I think. That agreement has now ceased to exist, so there is no restriction on textile-based products that can now be brought into the US, which of course has had significant implications for both the consumers there and the local producers. We also see things known as tariff rate quotas, which are like a hybrid, a crossover of a quota and a tariff, where a lower tariff is applied to imports within a certain limit, and then a higher rate is applied to those over that limit. So imagine that there's a restriction on the first 10,000 items of a particular good that can be brought into the country, and they will only be taxed at a 10% tariff rate, but then after every item after the 10,000 limit might be taxed at 50%. So of course that discourages the importers from bringing over that limit that the government has set. The final important term here is quota rent, and this refers to the extra profit, any extra profit that producers are able to make when the supply is artificially limited by the imposition of that import quota by the government. The fourth type of instrument of trade policy we're going to look at here is voluntary export restraints. So these are also a limitation on the number of items which can be brought into a particular country. But unlike the import quotas, which are set by the government of the nation where the products are being imported into, this restriction is imposed by the exporting country, and it's usually at the request of the importing country's government. Now this might seem a bit weird. Why would you as a government, given that we've spoken in previous weeks about the importance of trade surpluses and export-driven economies, why would you restrict and limit the amount that your local firms can actually export overseas? Well, usually, as I say, it's because you're being pressured to do so by one of your major trading partners. And this was absolutely what happened with the Japanese and the US market. So up until the start of the 60s, most cars that were sold in America looked like that. They were ginormous. They weren't particularly fuel or space efficient. They weren't great to drive, but that was what people were used to. Of course, in the 1970s, we then had the oil crisis, where we saw a dramatic restriction on the supply of oil on a global scale, which of course resulted in the increase in the price of oil and petrol therefore, which meant that Japanese cars in the 70s, which looked like this, and then moving into the 80s also, which looked like that, were perfectly suited to fill that gap, because here were much smaller cars, they were better to drive, and importantly, they were much more fuel efficient. And so in the US, as well as most of around the globe, these cars started to take over in popularity, certainly compared to those larger US-based products. This meant that the US government decided to step in. They recognised that a lot of the local producers were being hurt by this set of circumstances, and so they actually said, hey, government of Japan, we kind of need you to stop importing so many cars here, and if you don't, we will actually set trade restrictions on other industries. Given the importance of the US market to so many Japanese manufacturers, the government actually said, okay, fine, sure, we will limit the amount of cars as long as there are not further imposed restrictions here. So they actually limited and capped the number of vehicles that were allowed to be exported into the US market. So that's usually why this type of trade policy instrument occurs. There are also local content requirements, which, funnily enough, require some specific fraction of a good or item to be produced locally or sourced locally. And that might be either a percentage of the component parts or a percentage of the overall value of the good. So there are a couple of different ways that you can tackle this. Now, local content requirements were most commonly used by developing countries to help shift from assembly of goods to full-scale production of them. But what we're tending to find is that more and more developed countries are beginning to implement these as well. It was absolutely the case for a long time in Australia, where there were local content requirements in the car manufacturing industry to not only support the local manufacturers, but also support the supply-related industries for the car manufacturers there. So for a component parts manufacturer, local content requirements act the same as an import quota. It restricts the amount of imported supply components which may be brought into a particular country. So acts as an import quota in that sense. Again, like pretty much all of the instruments we've spoken about so far, it benefits the producers. It enables them to better compete against the cheaper imports, but usually means that it is not great for consumers, and it's often passed on or ultimately results in in us as consumers having to pay higher prices for these goods. Finally, we're going to look here at anti-dumping policies, and of course the dumping we're talking about here is not that kind. No, we're talking about the selling of goods in a foreign market at a price which is below their cost of production, or selling goods in a foreign market below their what is deemed to be fair market value. And of course this can be a bit subjective as to what exactly is fair market value, but it's basically selling things overseas often at a loss, just to get rid of them when you have excess supply. A lot of firms which are exporting just say, okay, we need to get rid of them to gain, especially to help us gain a foothold in a market. Let's initially sell these items at a unfairly low cost, which means that we'll become very popular, get that foothold in the market, and then longer term we can increase the prices and hopefully make more of a profit. So it does enable firms to unload excess production in foreign markets and can sometimes result in predatory behaviour. A lot of the local firms end up being or run out of business because they just can't compete with these large-scale importers who offer this excess production at such a low price. Governments can use countervailing duties to punish foreign firms that engage in dumping practices and protect the local producers from this perceived unfair foreign competition.